Hi, Michelle. We're just happy to be chatting with you today in connection with Joy Baker Day, what it's all about, and what we can learn from it. I wanted to talk a little bit, though, about, we see what happened with Joy and the kinds of things that the local authority were trying with her. Are we still seeing some of those behaviors today? So besides like the doorstepping, going into the homes, what are some of the other
Y-
things we're still
we
seeing
we we
today?
have we have I'm aware of a particular local authority that regularly requests, if parents don't allow access to the home, which you do not need to, there is no requirement to. If you're a certain type of family, so there's certain isms that happen here, then there will be a referral across to social services, who will then come and do an inquiry, because they do have to respond to a referral. Just doing their job. They're not doing anything wrong. They're doing their job. And I am aware of cases where social services have done their job, done their inquiry, and so nothing to see here. There isn't a safeguarding risk. Closed it, but before they closed it, they've actively tried to convince the parent to agree that they have visits on a regular basis from the home ed team. Now, when the parents have stood the line, and I've seen it both sides, when they haven't and when they have, when the parents have stood the line and said, but that's not your remit, there's nothing wrong with my home education. Have you got any concerns about my children? Because I do not need a child in need plan. After a few back and forth conversations, the social workers have gone away. But then other times they may have allowed and agreed the EHE visits, which would never have been agreed had the family not felt they had no choice, because social services were now asking. And those families have then let the LA in, and in some cases have ended up escalated to SAOs, because it wasn't actually about the home education, it was about control.
We need to clarify that an SAO is a school attendance order for anyone that
Sorry.
doesn't know. Yeah, we can throw the terminology, but we do find also things of local authorities misleading. So we used the example earlier of basically saying, "Oh, all of these people let us come in their homes," but there's other ways in which they mislead, such as conveniently, not telling you, well, we don't need to see a timetable. You don't have to follow the national curriculum. You don't,
Yeah,
those
there's
kinds of
quite a
things.
few introduction letters at the moment that presume you're going to let them in, and also ask for a provisional education plan when they're not actually entitled to a plan, because you're not
Yeah.
co-educating with them.
The
They're not a
wording
co-parent.
changes. Yeah, but the wording changes from one county to another.
Absolutely.
The one thing is, first of all, they'll give the person in that position a different title. So you can get confused sometimes because it might be an inclusion officer, it might be an access to education officer, it might be, what are some of the other interesting ones
My
we've heard?
least favourite is the education improvement officer.
Okay.
And that's in your introduction letter. You get advised you'll be allocated an
Yeah.
education improvement officer. Well, can you give me a chance to see if I can do it first before you decide to allocate them?
There
Now,
was
obviously,
one, there
that's
was,
just a title, but
yeah, but there was one that even had investigator in their title. So it was something like education investigator or something like that. And, I don't think they realize exactly how,
my
what
one's
that
actually a
conveys.
pupil tracking and licensing officer.
Oh dear.
Is what our home ed
Yeah.
area people are called.
Yeah, yeah, and they don't realize what that conveys, and sometimes the title is not really one that can stand up in. It's not supported by their legal position of what they can do, their remit. Um, I think some of the other things we do is local authorities wanting to kind of see people more than they need to, or get information more than they need to. Um,
Um,
that
yeah.
generally they should, once they're satisfied, they should leave you alone for a decent amount of time, shouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Because their scope is the first element of the scope is they need to make sure your child's not missing education. That absolutely is part of their role as a local authority. Because if a child is missing education, they do legally have a duty to put something in place. So they are doing their job when they're just checking that your child is receiving education in some way. And that can be you've already registered them at a school, but it's a different school, or you're choosing to home educate them. So they are just doing their job then. But the second
Yeah.
you've reassured them, no, my child doesn't need any help from you because we are home educating. I understand what I have to do under Section 7 of the Education Act. They should be on their way and leaving you alone unless something comes up.
Well, their
So it
legal
should just be
remit is,
routinely checking.
yeah, well, their legal remit is actually to make sure that the child isn't having an unsuitable education. So basically, yes, they're asking you to see or what you're providing, but it's just to satisfy themselves that it's like if you were saying, well, my education is, well, I take them out to the fields and they're picking wheat from morning till night, and I have to flog them occasionally. Definitely there would be an unsuitable education, and they would,
Okay.
so it's, well, what does that education look like? And as long as it's not unsuitable, they should be leaving you alone. Um,
And there's certain things we know they'll expect to see in there, and that's not necessarily because of them. That's because the guidance says it. That's because there's been previous cases. So they'll expect some literacy going on. They'll expect
yeah,
some numeracy going on. They'll expect that, you're not locking your child in a cupboard, that your child is
yeah,
getting to see other people.
yeah,
And they'd expect that they're getting some sort of physical exercise, even if that's a walk to the park or something.
yeah,
Um, Again, back to the not expecting you to have a Harry Potter child locked in the cupboard. But as long as you're ticking those boxes and ensuring it is suitable to your child, they're not
yes, yeah.
generally concerned if you're
Well,
in
they
the
shouldn't
good
be. They
LAs. Well,
shouldn't be,
none of them should be concerned. But
and
if
they
you're in
shouldn't.
the LAs that behave as they should, in completely in line with the law, they won't be
Yeah,
concerned.
and they shouldn't be asking to see you once a week or even once every 3 weeks or a couple of months. So, Michelle, what would you say is the single most important thing a parent can do to arm themselves so that, I believe knowledge is power. What do you think every parent should do when they start home educating?
The first thing they need to do is actually read up on what their responsibilities are and what their rights are, and on what the law actually expects of them. So that then if somebody tries to mislead them, you already know.
Yeah,
And we know from having supported families, the families that pull the LA up on what they say as a mislead, the majority of times correct themselves and start behaving differently as soon as they know you know your rights. Now, it shouldn't
yeah,
be your job to do that, but the way you hold the line and you ensure you do not end up being subjected to unnecessary, disproportionate interference by your local authority is by demonstrating you have done your research, you know what you do have to do, you know what you don't have to do, and you know that they're
yeah.
not allowed to be asking that. So bye bye.
Yeah, and we see Joy Baker doing this really well because actually, when she started, she just decided she didn't want to send her children to school. But at that point, I don't think she'd even checked the law on it.
I
It was
don't think she had at the
only
beginning.
when she found herself being challenged and she needed to go and have a look at what the law had to say. But by the end of it, she's an absolute expert in
Yeah.
what the law has said.
Yeah, and there
And
was no
that's,
experts for her to go to then
yeah,
because there wasn't there
yeah,
wasn't loads of people home educating then.
yeah,
We're now a community over 100,000 just across the UK.
yeah,
When she was doing it, the numbers were 100 would be excessive. I would say across the UK,
yeah,
they were single figures, maybe double figures, but they
yeah.
weren't above that as such at the point she was doing it.
And there are great supportive community organizations and groups, social media groups, and that kind of thing, where people can go if they really don't know where to find the information. But we would be talking specifically about the Education Act, is it Section 7,
Yeah, Section
and
7 Education Act
and
1996.
and the government guidance on home education. And there are two versions, one for the local authority, one for the parents. I do recommend reading both if you can. just to understand what's being said to local authorities, so you know what they're coming, where they're coming from.
And sometimes that's what causes confusion as well, because sometimes there's certain bits in the parent guide that are not in the local authority guide. So
Yeah,
in the parent guide, it's really important to read 5.1 that says about them not having any duties to monitor, which isn't reflected in the same way in the local authorities guide as it is in the parents one that tells you they don't have that.
yeah,
uh, and and section 2 in the parents one's very useful, because that also lists all the things you do not have to do as a parent. So
yeah,
if those things appear on your communications from your LA, you can absolutely point them to the government guidance, but just make sure you say whether it's parents or local authority, and point them to that section so that they can see where you're getting it from. That,
yeah.
no, I know I don't
So
have to do that.
important, so important to know that. And Michelle, before we wrap up, what do you? Oh, actually, before we wrap up, I wanted to say something. Earlier on, we mentioned uh, we were talking about maybe having access to exams and that kind of thing. And I've thought, yes, that would be really convenient because most parents are paying taxes at some point and they get nothing back in terms of education when they're home educating. But I know that the Department for Education, their stance is they don't want to do anything to make it easier for home educators because then more people would say, well, oh, well, I'm going to take my child out of school and then I know I can just bring them back for exams when they need it. And so they kind of don't want to be seen to be advocating or promoting it in any way. So that is the battle there with that. It would, to me, it makes perfect sense. Let a child go and just sit exams at any school, but um, you will find that local authorities will tell you that they're not allowed to promote
Which gets
home
interesting, because
education. Yeah,
there's been a handful over the years that will support with the odd bit of funding
yeah,
around exams, but it is the handful. This isn't never become a mainstream option from LAs.
yeah,
And it is an interesting argument, because if you're fundamentally going on child's rights, they don't even need to make it home educated. They could just say, over the age of 12, there's this pot of money from the LA every child can access for up to 5 level 2 exams. They could allow it. So a school child may not get entered for all the exams because maybe they can't achieve, because we know schools don't always enter them for all their exams. So they would also be able to access this pot of money for 5 exams, or maybe they want to do something a bit different to what's offered. Or if we're looking at exam centres, it's not just home educated children that are locked out, it's adult learners that are locked out. It's
yeah,
people who didn't get their qualifications when they were a child, um, maybe through they were in the school system and they didn't achieve, or maybe through other means they just didn't actually get them, or because you're allowed to leave school earlier, then maybe they just left to go to work.
yeah,
And when they come back to do their qualifications, there just aren't the affordable exam centres available to them.
yeah.
So it's not just a home ed argument, really. It's
Exactly. Yeah.
actually equitable access across the whole. Um,
Right. It's not
yeah,
equitable at all, is it? But the other side that a lot of people are concerned about is if we did go to the local authorities for exam help, if you're wanting to keep your name off a register, if you're wanting to operate sort of under the radar and just get on with it without interference, if your local authority then became aware of you because of exams, is that you would then have strings attached, or the government may put some strings that are attached to that, which could so a lot of home educators, they say, you know what, I would rather just be able to carry on as I am without government interference. And I think that is another part of the argument to consider, is whether you want to
absolutely,
be
absolutely.
um, accountable to the government at all in any way. Um,
Yeah.
so what I wanted to ask you though is just looking at the example of Joy Baker, um, what can we learn from her, and do you have any sort of words to kind of encourage us and inspire us?
I think, obviously, yeah, the 15th of November 1961 is significant, because Joy Baker was an average parent, a good enough parent, doing her best for her children. Um, and despite continuously being challenged on that by the local authorities, she held the line, and ultimately holding the line, and it wasn't easy or quick because we're talking a decade here, she was successful. She was able to hold the line and be able to secure that right to be able to home educate in the pretty free way we can now in this country. And I think we all need to take inspiration from that and ensure that we don't lose sight of the fact that one person standing up can actually make a difference. And therefore, if all of us stand up together as a community, we should be able to achieve a lot.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And just also to say it's not just about us, it's about the next generation. You know, we want to make sure that we keep that freedom available for the next generation. You know, if our children want to home educate their children, we don't put extra burdens on them by losing sight of
Absolutely.
of the prize here.